Sarah's legs gave out. She sank onto the damp basement concrete, staring at more money than she'd ever seen in her life, more than she'd prosecuted in her biggest cases. The bearer bonds were pristine, protected by vacuum-sealed plastic, their edges crisp as if printed yesterday, despite the 1987 dates stamped across their faces. Elena Santos. The name triggered fragments of memory from her prosecutor days, whispers in courthouse hallways about witnesses who vanished, cases that went cold overnight, federal marshals who wouldn't meet your eyes when you asked what happened to their charges. Above her head, the October rain drummed harder against the house's failing roof, and somewhere in that rhythm, Sarah heard footsteps. "Mom?" Lily's voice drifted down the basement stairs. The ceiling's leaking again. Sarah's hands moved with prosecutor precision, muscle memory from evidence rooms. She photographed the bonds with her phone, snapped pictures of the newspaper clipping, then carefully placed everything back inside the safe. Her fingers shook as she spun the combination lock closed. "Coming, sweetheart." Her voice cracked on the endearment. She climbed the warped wooden stairs to find her daughters huddled in the kitchen, the only room where the roof didn't leak directly onto the floor. At 9 years old, Lily and Emma had already learned to read their mother's moods with the survival instinct of children whose world had collapsed once before. They watched her face with quiet intensity. "Is everything okay?" Emma asked. The more perceptive twin, the one who'd stopped sleeping through the night after their Seattle house was foreclosed. Sarah forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "Just working on the basement. Nothing for you two to worry about." But worry was all she had left. 3 months ago, she'd been Sarah Chen, senior associate at Morrison & Associates, a bankruptcy firm with corner offices and coffee that didn't come from gas stations. She'd had a house in Wallingford with hardwood floors and a garden where the girls could play without worrying about tetanus from rusty nails. She'd had a business partner she trusted, before David Morrison cleaned out their client trust accounts and disappeared to somewhere without extradition treaties. The Washington State Bar's investigation had been swift and merciless. Client funds stolen, firm collapsed, Sarah's license suspended pending review. The fact that she'd been Morrison's victim rather than his accomplice mattered little to the disciplinary board. In their eyes, she'd failed to exercise proper oversight. She was complicit through negligence. The insurance settlement barely covered the client's immediate losses. Her personal assets, house, savings, Emma's college fund, went to make the rest whole. By August, she and the girls were living in her Honda Civic, showering at truck stops and pretending it was an adventure. The house on Birch Hollow Lane had appeared on a foreclosure website like salvation wrapped in rotting wood. Abandoned since 1987, the listing said. Previous owner deceased, no heirs. The bank just wanted it gone. Sarah had scraped together the 15 grand from her mother's life insurance policy, money she'd sworn to save for the girls' education. Instead, she'd bought them a house that might kill them all in their sleep. Now, staring at her daughters' thin faces in the yellow glow of the single working light fixture, she wondered if the universe was playing an elaborate joke. Downstairs sat enough money to solve every problem they'd ever have, enough to buy a real house, restore her law license, send the girls to any college they wanted. Money that belonged to people who killed federal witnesses. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Nice house. Shame if something happened to it." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. She glanced toward the windows, but the October darkness beyond the glass revealed nothing. The moss-covered panes could hide an army. "Girls, go upstairs and get ready for bed," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "But it's only 7:30, Lily protested. "Now." Something in her tone killed further argument. The twins gathered their homework and trudged upstairs, casting worried looks over their shoulders. Sarah moved through the house systematically, checking locks that barely functioned, peering through windows that might as well have been painted black. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound might herald their death. In the kitchen, she opened her laptop and searched for Elena Santos. The results made her stomach clench. Federal witness in a money laundering case against the Valdez cartel. Disappeared from protective custody in March 1987, along with critical evidence that could have brought down the entire organization. Case collapsed. Cartel leaders walked free. The house had been purchased that same month by Margaret Fairweather, paying cash through a shell corporation that had since dissolved. Elena Santos, Margaret Fairweather, same person. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the laptop. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its relentless assault on their fortress of rotting wood and broken dreams. Somewhere in that darkness, people were watching. People who'd waited 36 years to find their money. And somehow, impossibly, they'd arranged for her to be the one to find it. Sarah sat frozen at the kitchen table, laptop screen glowing in the dim light as the implications crashed over her like the rain hammering their fragile roof. The text message burned in her peripheral vision, but she couldn't bring herself to look at her phone again. Nice house. Shame if something happened to it. Upstairs, she could hear the girls moving through their bedtime routine. Water running in the single functioning bathroom, muffled conversations about homework, and the math test Emma was dreading. Normal sounds of normal children living a normal life, except nothing about their life had been normal for months. She forced herself to stand and check on them, climbing the groaning staircase that swayed slightly under her weight. The master bedroom had become their shared sanctuary by necessity. It was the only upstairs room where the ceiling wasn't actively collapsing. 2 sleeping bags lay side by side on an air mattress, surrounded by cardboard boxes that served as nightstands and dressers. "Teeth brushed?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes, Mom." Lily held up her toothbrush as evidence, fluoride foam still clinging to her chin. "When are we getting real beds?" The question was innocent enough, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Real beds. Such a simple thing that she couldn't provide. 3 months ago, the girls had slept in matching twin beds with princess comforters in their own rooms, each decorated according to their personalities. Lily's had been all purple and unicorns, Emma's a careful arrangement of books and art supplies. Now they shared an air mattress in a house that smelled of mildew and decades of abandonment. Soon, Sarah lied. The same lie she'd been telling for weeks. "We just need to get the house fixed up first." Emma sat cross-legged on the sleeping bag, homework spread around her like a paper fortress. Even in this chaos, she maintained her methodical approach to schoolwork, color-coding her folders and keeping her handwriting perfectly neat. The girl who'd once had her own desk and good lighting now did algebra by the glow of a camping lantern. "Mrs. Patterson asked if you could come in for a conference," Emma said without looking up from her math worksheet. "She wants to talk about the advanced placement program for next year." Sarah's chest tightened. Mrs. Patterson, their teacher at Salem Elementary, had been patient about the girls' transition to their new school, but Sarah could read between the lines. Emma was brilliant, had always been brilliant, but her grades were slipping. Hard to maintain a 4 gigapascals when you were doing homework in a house without adequate heat or lighting, when you were wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation because the washing machine was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'll call her tomorrow," Sarah said, adding it to the growing list of responsibilities that felt insurmountable. Parent-teacher conferences, grocery shopping with food stamps she was still learning to use without shame, finding a job that would hire a disbarred lawyer with a scandal trailing behind her like smoke. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" Lily asked hopefully. "Like we used to?" Before David Morrison stole their lives. Before Sarah's professional reputation became radioactive. Before they learned what it felt like to choose between paying for heat or groceries. "We'll see," Sarah said, another gentle deflection. The truth was they had cereal, generic brand from the discount store, and milk that would last maybe 2 more days if she rationed it carefully. She kissed both girls goodnight, inhaling their familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. They still smelled the same as they had in their old life, when she'd been a competent mother instead of someone dragging her children through the wreckage of her failures. Back downstairs, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Her heart hammered as she glanced at the screen, but this time it was just a reminder about Emma's dental appointment next week. An appointment she'd probably have to cancel because the community clinic was booked solid and their Medicaid application was still pending. She opened her laptop again and stared at the search results for Elena Santos. The woman had been younger than Sarah when she'd entered witness protection, probably scared and desperate and trusting that the federal marshals could keep her safe. Instead, she'd spent 36 years hiding in this rotting house, living under a false name, never knowing if today would be the day they found her. Had Elena Santos ever stood in this same kitchen, listening to the rain and wondering if the shadows outside held death? Had she ever calculated how much money could buy safety for the people she loved? Sarah's cursor hovered over another search, Valdez Cartel current operations. The results made her stomach twist. Unlike the cartels of the 1980s, today's organizations were sophisticated, tech-savvy, and utterly ruthless. They had resources that dwarfed most corporations and a reach that spanned continents. And somehow, they'd orchestrated her purchase of this house. The rain kept falling, and somewhere in that darkness, people were watching her daughter's school, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to apply pressure. Sarah closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to her children's breathing upstairs, and wondering if love was enough to save them from the choice she'd already started making. Sarah must have dozed at the kitchen table because she woke to the sound of a car engine cutting through the pre-dawn silence. Her neck ached from sleeping hunched over her laptop, and for a moment she couldn't remember why her heart was racing before the events of the previous night crashed back into focus. The bearer bonds. Elena Santos. The text message. She checked her phone, 5:47 a.m. Still dark outside, but the rain had finally stopped. Through the moss-stained kitchen window, she could make out the shape of a vehicle parked across the street, a dark SUV that hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. Her blood turned to ice. Sarah crept to the living room window, staying low, peering through a gap in the makeshift curtains she'd hung from discount store sheets. The SUV's windows were tinted black, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. Someone was inside, waiting, watching. A new text appeared on her phone. "Check your email." With trembling fingers, Sarah opened her laptop. A message from an address she didn't recognize, sent 3 minutes ago. No subject line. She clicked it open. "Miss Chen, we know about your discovery. We also know about Emma's math test today, and Lily's art project due Friday. We know which route they take to school, and that Emma stops at the library on Tuesdays. We know you're broke, desperate, and running out of options. The money in that safe has been waiting 36 years for the right person to find it. Elena Santos is dead. The federal case is closed. No one else has a claim to those bonds. You have 48 hours to decide. Take the money and disappear, or we'll help you disappear permanently. Your choice." There's a phone in the basement safe, behind the bonds. Use it. Sarah's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the laptop. They knew about the girls' schedules. They'd been watching long enough to learn intimate details of their lives. Emma's Tuesday library visits, which they'd only started 3 weeks ago. Lily's art project, which had been assigned just yesterday. How long had they been under surveillance? She forced herself to move, to think like the prosecutor she'd once been instead of the terrified mother she'd become. Evidence. Documentation. If she was going to survive this, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The basement felt different in the grey morning light, filtering through grimy windows. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she approached the safe, punching in the combination with muscle memory from the night before. The door swung open to reveal the neat stacks of bearer bonds, the newspaper clipping about Elena Santos's disappearance, and, tucked behind everything else, a burner phone she'd missed in her initial shock. The phone was ancient by modern standards, but had been expensive once, probably purchased in the days when Elena Santos still believed the federal marshals could protect her. Sarah powered it on, and immediately it rang. She nearly dropped it before finding the answer button. "Miss Chen." The voice was male, calm, professional. "I trust you found our message informative." "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, though she was alone in the basement. "Someone with a problem that requires your specific expertise." You were a federal prosecutor once, specializing in money laundering cases. You understand the law, the system, how things work. More importantly, you understand when the system fails people. Sarah's mouth went dry. What do you want? Elena Santos was supposed to disappear with that evidence 36 years ago. Instead, she hid it and lived like a prisoner in that house until cancer finally did what we couldn't. But her death created an opportunity. For what? Those bonds are untraceable, clean, perfect for someone who needs a fresh start. The voice paused. Your daughters deserve better than food stamps and a collapsing house, don't you think? The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Sarah thought of Emma doing homework by lamplight, of Lily asking about real beds, of the dental appointments she'd have to cancel and the parent-teacher conferences she couldn't afford to attend because taking time off from her minimum-wage job meant no groceries that week. This is insane, she breathed. I can't just... You can't afford not to. The bank will foreclose on this house in 3 months when you miss your first payment. Child Services is already asking questions about your living situation. How long before they decide the girls would be better off in foster care? The threat landed like a physical blow. Sarah had been so focused on keeping them fed and sheltered that she hadn't considered how their situation looked to outside observers. 2 children living in a house without proper heating or plumbing, their mother unemployed and essentially homeless. Take the money, Miss Chen. Disappear. Give your daughters the life they deserve. The voice softened slightly. Elena Santos spent 36 years in that prison. Don't make the same mistake. Use her sacrifice to save yourself. The line went dead. Sarah stood in the basement, surrounded by rotting wood and the smell of decades-old secrets, holding a phone that connected her to people who killed federal witnesses. Outside, her daughters were probably waking up, getting ready for another day at a school where they pretended everything was fine. She looked at the bearer bonds, each one worth more than she'd earned in years of legal practice. Enough money to buy safety, security, a future where Emma could focus on algebra instead of survival, and Lily could have her real bed with purple sheets. All she had to do was become everything she'd once fought against. The choice was hers. Sarah climbed the basement stairs on unsteady legs. The burner phone clutched in her sweaty palm like evidence of her own corruption. The morning light filtering through the grimy windows seemed harsh now, exposing every crack in the walls, every stain on the floor, every failure written into the bones of this house. Become everything she'd once fought against. The words echoed in her mind as she heard movement upstairs, the girls starting their morning routine. In 20 minutes, she'd walk them to the bus stop, kissing their foreheads and pretending their world wasn't balanced on the edge of a knife. She'd watch them disappear into their day while knowing that strangers had catalogued their every move, their every vulnerability. Sarah sank onto the sagging couch and stared at her hands. These same hands had once signed indictments against money launderers, had built cases that sent financial criminals to federal prison. She'd believed in justice then, in the clean lines between right and wrong, in a system that protected the innocent and punished the guilty. But where had that system been when David Morrison emptied their client accounts? Where was justice when her professional reputation was destroyed through no fault of her own, when her children went hungry because she'd followed the rules while others broke them with impunity? The burner phone felt heavy as a weapon. One call could change everything. One decision could give Emma the advanced placement program she deserved, could give Lily the purple bedroom she dreamed about. Real beds, regular meals, a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Child Services is already asking questions. Sarah's chest constricted. She thought of the intake counselor at the girls' new school, the way her gaze had lingered on their discount store clothes, the careful questions about their living situation. Sarah had been so focused on legal threats, foreclosure, bankruptcy, professional sanctions that she'd ignored the more immediate danger. What if they took the girls? The thought made her physically sick. Emma and Lily in separate foster homes, confused and traumatized, calling out for a mother who'd failed to protect them. All because Sarah Chen had been too proud, too rigid, too committed to principles that no one else seemed to follow. She pulled up her banking app on her phone, though she already knew the numbers by heart. Checking account, $127.43. Savings, $0. Credit cards, maxed out and in collections. The girls' school lunch accounts showed negative balances that made her cheeks burn with shame. Downstairs, $260 million sat in neat stacks, waiting. Money that had belonged to the Valdez cartel. She'd researched enough to know they weren't some remnant from the 1980s. They were current, active, and absolutely ruthless. But they were also business people, and keeping Elena Santos's evidence buried served their interests as much as hers. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up news articles about cartel operations, trying to think like the prosecutor she'd once been. The Valdez organization had evolved since Elena Santos's time, transforming from a crude smuggling ring into a sophisticated international enterprise. They owned legitimate businesses now, employed lawyers and accountants, operated with the kind of calculated professionalism that suggested they could honor an agreement. But they also disappeared federal witnesses. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma, "Mom, where are you? Bus comes in 10 minutes. Sarah rushed upstairs to find both girls dressed and ready, backpacks shouldered, looking at her with a patient concern that children shouldn't have to feel for their parents. When had the roles reversed? When had her 9-year-old daughters become the responsible ones? "Sorry, sweetheart. Just lost track of time." "You look tired," Lily said, reaching up to touch Sarah's cheek with small fingers. "Are you sleeping okay?" "No, baby. I'm awake at night calculating whether I love you enough to become a criminal. I'm fine, just house stuff. You know how it is." Emma's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Is someone bothering you? Yesterday you seemed scared. Too perceptive." Emma had always been the observer, the one who noticed what adults tried to hide. Another reason to get them out of this situation before it damaged them further. They walked to the bus stop in silence, Sarah hyper-aware of every shadow, every parked car, every face that might be watching. The dark SUV was gone, but that didn't mean the surveillance had stopped. It just meant they were better at hiding now. The school bus arrived with its familiar rumble of diesel and childhood chaos. Sarah kissed both girls goodbye, holding them a fraction longer than usual, breathing in their strawberry shampoo scent like armor against the choice she was being forced to make. "I love you both," she whispered. "Love you too, Mom," they chorused, climbing onto the bus with their patched backpacks and second-hand clothes, disappearing into seats beside children whose mothers weren't contemplating deals with cartels. Sarah stood at the empty bus stop long after the yellow vehicle disappeared, staring at the burner phone in her hand. $260 million. Her daughter's safety. A future built on blood money. The choice was becoming less impossible by the hour. The bus stop felt like the edge of the world after the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. Sarah stood there clutching the burner phone, watching the ordinary morning unfold around her. Neighbors heading to work, joggers following their daily routes, the postal truck making its rounds. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the weight of impossible choices. She couldn't be one of them anymore. Sarah walked back toward the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The moss-covered Victorian loomed ahead like a monument to her failures, its broken shutters and sagging porch a perfect metaphor for everything she'd tried to build and lost. But hidden in its basement was a different kind of monument. 260 million reasons to stop being a victim. Inside, the silence felt different, expectant. The house itself seemed to be waiting for her decision, its rotted bones holding secrets that demanded resolution. Sarah descended to the basement, her footsteps echoing in the damp air, and opened the safe one more time. The bearer bonds sat exactly as she'd left them, neat stacks of financial perfection that could solve every problem she faced. Next to them, the newspaper clipping about Elena Santos's disappearance seemed to mock her hesitation. Elena had tried to do the right thing, cooperating with federal prosecutors, trusting the system to protect her. In return, she'd spent 36 years in this rotting prison, watching the world through dirty windows, never knowing if today would bring discovery and death. Sarah picked up one of the bonds, studying the crisp paper and ornate printing. Untraceable. Clean. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear. The caller had been right about that. Bearer bonds were the financial equivalent of cash, requiring no identification or documentation to convert. Elena Santos had inadvertently created the perfect escape route. The burner phone rang in her hand. Ms. Chen. The same calm, professional voice. I trust you've had time to consider our proposal. Sarah found herself standing straighter, prosecutor instincts kicking in despite everything. I need guarantees. If I take this money, how do I know you won't come after us anyway? Because we're business people, not animals. Elena Santos had evidence that could have destroyed operations worth billions. With her death, that threat ended, but only if the evidence stays buried. Your silence serves our interests. If I refuse, a pause, then you become a different kind of problem, one that requires a more permanent solution. The threat was delivered with the same professional calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than any amount of shouting or bluster. These weren't street thugs. They were sophisticated criminals who'd spent decades building an empire. Sarah represented nothing more than a minor operational detail to be resolved. I need time. You have children, Miss Chen. Emma's bus gets back at 3:47 p.m. Lily's at 4:15 because of her after-school art program. Time is a luxury you can't afford. The casual mention of her daughter's schedules sent ice through Sarah's veins. They knew everything, not just general information, but intimate details of their daily lives. How long had they been watching? How many photos did they have? How many opportunities to hurt the only people in the world who mattered? Sarah closed her eyes and saw Emma doing homework by lamplight, Lily asking about purple bedsheets, both of them trying so hard to be brave in a situation no child should endure. She thought about child services, about foster care, about all the ways the system could fail them, even if the cartel didn't intervene. She thought about Elena Santos, who tried to do the right thing and paid for it with 36 years of imprisonment. What exactly are you proposing? Simple. Take the money. Leave Oregon. Start over somewhere warm with good schools and no questions asked. Live the life Elena Santos never could. Sarah opened her eyes and stared at the bonds. And in exchange? You forget you ever heard of Elena Santos or the Valdez organization. The evidence in that safe disappears forever. Everyone gets what they want. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Everything she'd been taught about right and wrong, everything she'd built her career on, screamed against what she was contemplating. But louder than those voices was the memory of her daughters' faces, their trust that somehow their mother would fix everything and make them safe. Maybe this was what fixing everything looked like. I'll need help with logistics, Sarah heard herself saying, as if from a great distance. Documentation, transportation, converting the bonds without triggering federal reporting requirements. All handled. There's an envelope in the safe behind the phone. Instructions for tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. The threshold between her old life and whatever came next, between Sarah Chen, the failed lawyer, and someone else entirely. Someone who could give her daughters everything they deserved. Miss Chen, do we have an agreement? Sarah looked at the bonds one last time, then at the yellowed newspaper clipping that told the story of a woman who'd trusted the system and lost everything. Yes, she whispered. We have an agreement. The phone went dead, leaving her alone in the basement with the weight of her decision and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. There was no going back now. Sarah stood frozen in the basement silence, staring at the dead phone in her hand. The weight of what she'd just agreed to pressed against her chest like a physical presence, making each breath feel deliberate and strange. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the bankruptcy lawyer who'd lost everything to someone else's crimes. She was someone else now. A woman who made deals with cartels, who chose survival over principles. The envelope waited behind the phone exactly where the caller had promised. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled it free, noting the expensive paper stock and the way it had been sealed with old-fashioned wax. Even their instructions carried a sense of professional pride that somehow made everything more terrifying than crude threats would have. Inside, a single sheet of paper outlined tomorrow night's logistics with bureaucratic precision. A parking lot outside Salem. Midnight. Specific instructions about what to bring, what to leave behind, and how the exchange would work. At the bottom, a phone number and the words, "Your new life begins here." Sarah sank onto the basement's concrete floor, envelope clutched in her shaking hands. Above her, the house creaked and settled, its rotting beams adjusting to another day of decay. In 12 hours, the girls would come home from school expecting dinner and homework help and bedtime stories. Normal things, mother things, things that might become memories if tomorrow night went wrong. Her laptop sat open on the workbench, where she'd researched the Valdez organization. Sarah closed it without reading further. She'd learned enough to know they honored their agreements when it served their interests. The question was whether those interests aligned with hers for longer than it took to eliminate a witness. The burner phone rang again, startling her so violently she nearly dropped it. "One more thing, Miss Chen." The same voice, but warmer now, almost friendly. "You'll need documentation for your new identity. Driver's licenses, social security cards, school records for the girls. All pristine, all genuine. Consider it a signing bonus." "How?" "We employ excellent people. Your daughters will be Emma and Lily Martinez starting Tuesday morning. You'll be Maria Martinez, widow of a construction contractor who left you well provided for. Texas birth certificates, employment history, even medical records. Everything you need for your fresh start." The efficiency was staggering. In less than 24 hours, they'd constructed entire new identities that would pass federal scrutiny. These weren't street criminals. They were professionals operating at the highest levels of organized crime. What about the house, my old identity? Sarah Chen will simply disappear. It happens more often than you'd think. Single mothers facing foreclosure, overwhelming debt, social services investigations, they sometimes just run. Local police will file a missing persons report, but with no evidence of foul play and no resources for extensive searches. The voice trailed off meaningfully. These cases go cold quickly. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the headlines. Another deadbeat parent who'd abandoned her responsibilities. Another statistic in the epidemic of family abandonment. Her former colleagues would shake their heads and move on to more pressing matters. The girls' teachers would express concern for a few weeks, then forget as new students filled their seats. Only she would know the truth, that Sarah Chen had died to save her daughters, killed by love and desperation and the failure of every system she'd once trusted. "Martinez family has no criminal history," the voice continued. "No suspicious connections. No reason for anyone to look twice. You'll be invisible, Miss Chen. Exactly what you need to keep your daughters safe. Your daughters. Not Emma and Lily anymore, but whatever names appeared on their new birth certificates. Children who would grow up not knowing their mother had sacrificed everything, including her soul, to give them a chance at normal lives. I need to pick them up from school," Sarah said numbly. "They'll be worried if I'm late. Of course. Normal routine today, normal tonight. Tomorrow everything changes." The phone went dead again, leaving Sarah alone with the enormity of what she'd set in motion. She climbed the basement stairs mechanically, moving through the ruined house like a ghost haunting her own life. In the kitchen she made coffee from the last of their emergency supplies and sat at the rickety table where the girls did homework by lamplight. 12 hours until they came home. 24 hours until Maria Martinez was born, and Sarah Chen ceased to exist. Tomorrow night, she would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, making herself complicit in decades of cartel operations to protect two little girls who trusted her to fix everything. The coffee tasted like ashes, but Sarah drank it anyway. She needed the caffeine. She needed to be sharp for what came next, the last day of being their real mother, the final hours before she became someone else entirely. Outside, October rain began falling again, washing over the moss-covered roof and running down windows that had watched Elena Santos live and die as a prisoner of her own good intentions. Sarah wouldn't make the same mistake. She would become the monster if that's what her daughter's safety required. The rain drummed against the kitchen windows with relentless persistence, each drop a countdown to tomorrow night's point of no return. Sarah sat at the rickety table, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers instead of bitter liquid that tasted like surrender. The house groaned around her, its rotting bones settling deeper into their slow collapse, a fitting soundtrack for the death of Sarah Chen. She forced herself to move, to maintain the illusion of normalcy that would carry them through the next 24 hours. Upstairs, she pulled clothes from their meager collection, trying to decide what Maria Martinez would pack for a midnight disappearance. Everything had to look natural, spontaneous, a desperate mother making panicked decisions, not a calculated criminal executing a plan. The girls' artwork covered one wall of their makeshift bedroom, crayon drawings of the life they'd lost in Seattle mixed with hopeful sketches of the future they imagined. Emma's precise renderings of houses with actual furniture, Lily's purple-heavy fantasies of bedrooms with matching curtains and endless bookshelves. Tomorrow, those dreams would come true in ways they could never understand. Sarah touched Lily's latest creation, a family portrait showing the three of them in front of a fixed-up Victorian, complete with a garden and a dog and sunshine breaking through the Oregon clouds. The innocence in those crayon strokes made her chest tighten with something that felt like grief for choices not yet made. Her old laptop sat on the dresser, its browser history full of desperate job searches and foreclosure prevention resources. Sarah deleted everything methodically, erasing the digital footprints of a woman who'd tried so hard to solve problems legally. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years prosecuting money launderers, and now she was about to become one herself. The burner phone buzzed with a text. Final arrangements confirmed. Midnight tomorrow. Come alone. Sarah stared at the message until it blurred, then deleted it and powered down the phone. In the basement, $260 million waited in patient silence, more money than she could conceptualize. Elena Santos had died guarding it, and now Sarah would use it to purchase the one thing more valuable than wealth: her daughter's safety. She found herself standing in the living room where Emma and Lily had built a fort from moving boxes and old blankets, their imaginations transforming cardboard into a castle where problems couldn't reach them. Soon they'd have real castles, real safety, real futures. The cost would be Sarah's soul, but that seemed like a bargain when measured against their lives. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway sent panic shooting through her nerves. Sarah moved to the window, staying hidden behind the curtain as she peered out. A postal truck was backing away from their mailbox, leaving behind a thin stack of what would undoubtedly be more bills and threats she couldn't answer. But for a moment, she'd thought it might be them. The watchers who'd made Emma and Lily's bus schedules sound like death threats. Tomorrow night, that surveillance would end, either because she'd become their ally or because she'd become their victim. Sarah retrieved the mail with shaking hands, sorting through foreclosure notices and collection demands that would soon become someone else's problem. At the bottom of the stack, a letter from the girls' school requested a conference about their adjustment challenges. The counselor had noticed their worn clothes, their listless attention, their mother's increasing absence from school events that required time she couldn't afford to take. Another system preparing to fail them. Another reason to choose the devil's bargain over the angel's poverty. The kitchen clock showed 2:30. Emma's bus would arrive soon, followed by Lily an hour later. Sarah had planned to use this time to organize their escape, to prepare for the logistics of becoming the Martinez family. Instead, she found herself paralyzed by the weight of what she was stealing from them, along with their old identities. Emma would never know that her mother had once prosecuted the very criminals who now funded their new life. Lily would never understand why they'd left Oregon so suddenly, why the moss-covered house had been abandoned just as they'd started making it home. They'd grow up believing in Maria Martinez's carefully constructed past, never knowing that their real mother had died in a basement surrounded by blood money and impossible choices. The relationship between them would fracture in ways they couldn't see, built on lies, sustained by criminal proceeds, protected by the very forces Sarah had once sworn to fight. but it would be a relationship between living people rather than a memory of the dead. Outside, the yellow school bus appeared through the rain like a beacon of the normal world she was about to leave forever. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door, preparing to greet her daughters for what might be the last time as their real mother. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Today she still had time to love them as Sarah Chen. The yellow bus hissed to a stop, and Emma emerged looking smaller than her 11 years, backpack weighing her down as she trudged through the mud. Sarah opened the door with a smile that felt like broken glass against her face, watching her daughter's eyes for any sign that the watchers had made contact. "How was school, sweetheart?" Emma shrugged, kicking off wet sneakers that had developed new holes since yesterday. "Mrs. Patterson asked if we're moving again. She said the office needs updated contact information." Her voice carried the wary exhaustion of a child who'd learned not to trust stability. Sarah's blood went cold. "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know. Because I don't." Emma's accusatory stare cut deep. "Are we moving again, Mom? Because Tyler said his dad saw men watching our house yesterday, and everyone's talking about how weird we are." Men watching the house. The surveillance hadn't been as subtle as they'd claimed. Sarah knelt to Emma's level, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We might have to leave Oregon, Em, but not because we're in trouble. Because better opportunities are coming our way." "What opportunities? You can't even find a job here." The bitter truth in her daughter's words hit like a physical blow. 11 years old, and Emma already understood that her mother was failing them. That every promise of things getting better had crumbled into disappointment and mounting desperation. "I know you don't trust me right now," Sarah said carefully, "but I need you to believe that everything I do is to keep you and Lily safe. Can you do that for me?" Emma's face crumpled slightly, revealing the scared little girl beneath her defensive armor. "I'm tired of being scared, Mom. I'm tired of not knowing what happens next." Sarah pulled her daughter close, memorizing the feel of Emma's thin shoulders and the strawberry scent of her hair. Tomorrow, this exact embrace would belong to Maria Martinez, a woman who'd never prosecuted cartel operations, never lost everything to someone else's greed, never stood in a basement making deals with devils. "I know you're tired," Sarah whispered, "but I promise you, after tomorrow we'll never have to be scared again." An hour later, Lily bounded off her bus with paint-stained fingers and excitement radiating from every gesture. Where Emma had learned caution, Lily still believed in magic, in mothers who could fix anything, in futures that sparkled with possibility. "Mom, look what I made." Lily thrust a construction paper creation towards Sarah, a house with windows that opened to reveal tiny families drawn inside. "Miss Rodriguez said I could take it home because you might like it." Sarah studied the artwork, noting how Lily had drawn their family in the biggest window, arms outstretched toward a sun that took up half the sky. Such unshakable optimism in the face of everything that had gone wrong. Tomorrow, that optimism would be rewarded in ways Lily could never understand. "It's beautiful, baby. We'll hang it up right away." "Can we put it in my room? When we fix my room, I mean. You said we'd get purple stuff when the money situation got better." Lily's face lit with anticipation. "Is the money situation better now?" The innocent question landed like a knife in Sarah's chest. Lily didn't know about the $260 million sitting in their basement, didn't understand that the money situation had become infinitely more complicated than any 8-year-old could comprehend. "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "The money situation is about to get much better." They spent the evening maintaining rituals that would become memories. Homework at the kitchen table, dinner from a can heated on the portable burner, stories read by lamplight in the makeshift bedroom. Sarah found herself studying her daughter's faces with desperate intensity, cataloguing every expression and gesture of the children they were before tomorrow transformed them into someone else's daughters. Emma fell asleep first, exhaustion finally overwhelming her anxiety. Lily lasted longer, chattering about art class and her friend Madison, and whether they could get a kitten when they weren't poor anymore. Each innocent plan for their future felt like another betrayal Sarah was preparing to commit. "Mom." Lily's voice was drowsy but persistent. "Are you sad about something?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, fighting back tears that threatened to shatter her careful composure. "Just thinking about how much I love you, both of you, more than anything in the whole world." "Even more than you love Daddy?" The question caught Sarah off guard. They rarely talked about David anymore, the husband and father who died when the girls were too young to really understand loss. He'd been a good man, an honest man who'd built their life through hard work and ethical choices. What would he think of the woman his wife was becoming? Different kind of love, baby. But yes, even more than that. Lily smiled sleepily. "Good, because we love you more than anything too." After Lily's breathing deepened into sleep, Sarah sat in the darkness watching her daughters and feeling time slip away like water through her fingers. In 18 hours, Sarah Chen would cease to exist. These were her final moments as their real mother, her last night before crossing a line that would change everything. The house settled around them with its familiar groans and whispers, keeping secrets that had killed one woman and would now transform another. Sarah closed her eyes and prepared to say goodbye to the person she used to be. The morning shattered Sarah's fragile peace at 5:47 a.m. with the shriek of her burner phone. She fumbled for it in the pre-dawn darkness, careful not to wake the girls sleeping beside her. "Change of plans." The voice was different this time, younger, more urgent. "We need you to move now. Pack light and get to the rendezvous point within the hour." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "What happened? You said midnight tomorrow." "Federal task force hit one of our operations in Portland 3 hours ago. Someone's been feeding them information, and we're cleaning house. Every loose end, every potential witness." The words carried lethal implications. "That includes you, Miss Chen." The phone went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the ceiling as her carefully constructed plan dissolved into chaos. She'd counted on having today, one last normal day with Emma and Lily, time to prepare them psychologically for the transition, moments to say goodbye to Sarah Chen with some dignity intact. Instead, she had less than an hour before armed men arrived expecting compliance or delivering death. Sarah slipped from the bed and crept downstairs, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The girls couldn't travel in their pajamas to whatever dark rendezvous awaited them. They'd need clothes, explanations, reassurances she didn't have time to craft properly. Everything was accelerating beyond her control. In the kitchen, she grabbed garbage bags and started throwing together essentials: cereal, crackers, juice boxes, anything that might comfort frightened children during a journey into the unknown. Her hands shook as she worked, muscle memory from other midnight departures overlaying this moment with echoes of David's death, of fleeing Seattle, of every time circumstances had forced her to rebuild their lives from nothing. But this time felt different, final. The sound of a car door slamming outside sent panic shooting through her nervous system. They were early. The deal had been an hour, but headlights were already sweeping across the living room windows, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she'd never been negotiating from a position of strength. She was a liability to be managed, not a partner to be trusted. Heavy footsteps crossed the front porch, followed by the soft scraping of someone testing the door handle. Sarah's breath caught. She'd forgotten to lock it after checking the mail yesterday, a mistake that now felt like an invitation to violence. The door swung open silently, revealing 2 figures in dark clothing who moved with the predatory efficiency of professionals. One pointed toward the stairs, while the other advanced into the kitchen, where Sarah stood frozen among her pathetic preparations for escape. "Ms. Chen." The taller man's voice carried no warmth, no pretense of partnership. "Where are your daughters?" "Sleeping upstairs." But the arrangement changed when Agent Morrison's body turned up in the Columbia River this morning. His cold smile confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "Turns out Elena Santos didn't die as quietly as we thought. She had insurance policies, federal contacts, people who've been waiting 36 years for justice. Sarah's legs nearly buckled. Elena Santos, Margaret Fairweather, had been more than just a terrified witness hiding in a decaying house. She'd been actively working against the cartel, feeding information to law enforcement, using her decades of captivity to build a case that was now coming to fruition. And Sarah had walked directly into the center of it all. The money in the basement, the man continued conversationally, was never just hidden assets. It was bait, evidence, recorded serial numbers tracked by federal agencies for over 3 decades. His laugh held no humor. Every bill you've touched ties you to cartel operations going back to the Reagan administration. The room tilted sickeningly as Sarah understood the trap's true dimensions. She hadn't found a solution to their problems. She'd discovered a carefully laid snare designed to catch anyone who might stumble across Elena's final gambit. The house hadn't been randomly for sale. Her background as a money-laundering prosecutor hadn't been coincidence. Someone had wanted her specifically to find that money, to become complicit, to transform from hunter to hunted. "My daughters had nothing to do with this," Sarah whispered. "They're innocent children. Children of a federal witness who can testify about cartel operations spanning 4 decades. The man checked his watch with casual indifference. "They're leverage now, Miss Chen. Insurance against your cooperation." Upstairs, floorboards creaked as the second man moved through their bedroom. Sarah heard Emma's sleepy voice asking questions, Lily's confused protests, the sounds of her daughters being pulled from the only safety they'd ever known. Everything she'd sacrificed to protect them had led directly to this moment of absolute failure. The money that should have bought their freedom had instead purchased their destruction. The house that seemed like salvation had been their tomb all along. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to her daughters' frightened voices calling for her, knowing that Sarah Chen was already dead, killed not by bullets or blades, but by the lethal mathematics of choices that had never really been choices at all. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and buckling her knees. She gripped the kitchen counter as understanding flooded through her with devastating clarity, not just about Elena Santos or the cartel, but about herself and the elaborate deception that had brought her to this moment. She hadn't been randomly selected for this nightmare. Every step of her journey had been orchestrated, from the client who'd embezzled from her Seattle practice to the bankruptcy that had forced her desperate flight to Oregon. Even the house listing, a moss-covered Victorian for the impossible price of $15,000, had been crafted specifically to lure Sarah Chen, former money-laundering prosecutor, into Elena Santos's decades-long endgame. "Your FBI," she whispered, the words tumbling from her lips as the final pieces clicked into place. "Elena was feeding information to federal agents, and you've been watching, waiting for someone with my exact background to find that money." The tall man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise flickering across his features before settling back into cold professionalism. But that momentary crack was enough. Sarah had spent years reading faces across courtroom tables, learning to spot the tells that separated truth from performance. The cartel connection was real, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as the pattern emerged. But Elena Santos wasn't hiding from them. She was building a case against them. For 36 years. And you needed someone with prosecutorial experience to stumble across that evidence, to validate its authenticity, to become an unwitting witness to its discovery. Upstairs, Emma's voice carried a note of genuine terror now, and Sarah's maternal instincts roared against the analytical clarity flooding her mind. But she forced herself to follow the logic to its conclusion, because understanding the trap was the only way to escape it. The embezzlement that destroyed my practice, that was you. You manufactured my bankruptcy, guided me toward this exact property, made sure I'd be desperate enough to buy a house that any rational person would have avoided. The betrayal cut deeper than physical pain. My daughter's suffering, their hunger, their fear, all of it was orchestrated to get me here. The man's hand moved toward his jacket, and Sarah realized she'd pushed too far, revealed too much understanding. But the revelation had unlocked something else. A rage so pure and focused it burned away her paralyzing terror. "Emma!" she screamed toward the ceiling. "Run! Get Lily and run!" The shout shattered the careful choreography of the moment. Heavy footsteps thundered overhead as the second operative moved to secure the girls, while the man in front of Sarah drew his weapon with practiced efficiency. But Sarah was already moving, driven by the desperate mathematics of motherhood and the prosecutor's instinct that had identified this moment as her only chance. She grabbed the portable burner from the counter and hurled it at the kitchen window, shattering glass and triggering the house's ancient smoke detector in a shrieking wail that would wake the entire neighborhood. Then she lunged toward the basement door, toward the money that had doomed them all but might yet provide salvation. "Stop!" The man's voice cracked with authority, but Sarah was already plunging down the wooden steps into Elena Santos's carefully preserved mausoleum. The metal briefcases sat exactly where she'd left them. $260 million in bearer bonds that represented decades of evidence against one of the most powerful criminal organizations in North America. But Sarah wasn't reaching for the money. She was diving toward the corner where Elena's skeletal remains lay, surrounded by documents and photographs that told the real story. Her fingers closed around Elena's final insurance policy, a thick envelope marked federal evidence, agent contact protocol in Elena's careful handwriting. Inside, Sarah glimpsed FBI badge numbers, encrypted communication frequencies, and detailed instructions for activating a witness protection network that had been waiting 36 years for this moment. Elena Santos hadn't died in hiding. She'd died in service, maintaining her cover even as cancer consumed her, protecting evidence that would finally bring justice to the criminals who'd stolen her life. The man appeared at the top of the basement stairs, weapon trained on Sarah's back. "Step away from the evidence, Miss Chen. This doesn't have to end badly for your daughters." But Sarah understood now that her daughters had never been in real danger. Not from him. The FBI didn't murder children to protect investigations. The terror in Emma and Lily's voices upstairs was real, but it wasn't lethal. It was theater, designed to ensure Sarah's compliance in the final act of Elena's long game. "Agent Morrison isn't dead," Sarah said without turning around. "And you're not cartel operatives. You're federal agents, and this whole nightmare has been an elaborate operation to get me to authenticate Elena's evidence cache." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the continued wailing of the smoke detector and the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Backup Sarah suddenly realized had always been standing by, waiting for this revelation to play out exactly as Elena Santos had scripted it 36 years ago. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before the man slowly lowered his weapon. "My name is Agent David Kowalski, and yes, you're right about almost everything." His voice carried exhaustion that hadn't been there moments before, as if maintaining the deception had drained something essential from him. "But Agent Morrison really is dead, and the cartel really is coming." Sarah turned slowly, Elena's contact protocols clutched against her chest. The approaching sirens grew louder, but instead of relief, she felt only a deeper, more complex dread settling into her bones. "You said I was right about almost everything. What did I get wrong?" Footsteps thundered down the basement stairs as 2 more figures appeared. A woman in FBI tactical gear and a younger man whose badge read Special Agent Torres. The woman moved immediately to Elena's remains, photographing everything with practiced efficiency, while Torres began carefully cataloging the briefcases of bearer bonds. "The operation was real," Kowalski continued. "Elena Santos spent 36 years feeding U.S. intelligence about Valdez cartel operations across the Pacific Northwest. But 3 days ago, someone inside our task force leaked the location of this house to cartel leadership." His face hardened. "Morrison died trying to warn us. They tortured him for 12 hours before dumping his body in the Columbia." The basement suddenly felt smaller, pressing in around Sarah as the full scope of her situation crystallized. Not rescued, temporarily protected maybe, but still trapped in the center of a decades-long war between federal agents and one of the most violent criminal organizations in the hemisphere. "Agent Chen," the woman said, looking up from Elena's remains. "I'm Special Agent Diana Walsh. We need to debrief you immediately, but first, are your daughters safe? Agent Chen? Sarah's voice cracked on the unfamiliar title. Elena's final communications mentioned you specifically, Walsh explained, her tone gentling slightly. She'd been monitoring your career for years, following your prosecution of money laundering cases in Seattle. When your practice collapsed, she convinced our task force that you were the perfect candidate to authenticate her evidence cache. The pieces were falling into place, but each revelation felt like another weight added to Sarah's chest. The embezzlement that destroyed my practice. You said that was orchestrated. Kowalski shook his head. That was real. But Elena saw an opportunity in your desperation. She arranged for this property to be listed at a price you could afford, in a location isolated enough for our operation to proceed without civilian casualties. Civilian casualties. Sarah repeated the phrase flatly. My daughters are 8 years old, which is why they're currently in the protective custody of Agents Martinez and Thompson upstairs, Walsh said. The screaming you heard was theater, designed to maintain operational security until we could verify your identity and Elena's evidence simultaneously. Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the basement's concrete floor beside Elena's remains. The magnitude of what Elena Santos had endured, 36 years of isolation, illness, and fear, all in service of building a case against the people who'd stolen her life, felt overwhelming. And now Sarah had inherited not just Elena's evidence, but her war. What happens now? She whispered. Torres looked up from the briefcases. 260 million in bearer bonds, all with serial numbers that trace back to specific cartel operations dating to 1987. Plus Elena's documentation of drug routes, money laundering schemes, and corrupt officials across 3 states. His voice carried professional admiration. This is the most comprehensive cartel intelligence package the Bureau has ever recovered. That doesn't answer my question, Sarah said. What happens to my daughters? To me? Elena Santos died in this basement after 36 years of hiding. Is that my future now? Walsh crouched beside Sarah, her expression mixing sympathy with grim determination. Elena chose isolation because she didn't trust anyone. But you won't be alone. Our task force has spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Safe houses, new identities, protection protocols that Elena never had access to. The Valdez cartel has a long memory and unlimited resources, Kowalski added quietly. Elena's evidence will destroy their Pacific Northwest operations and implicate dozens of their associates. They'll spend everything they have trying to eliminate the witnesses who can testify against them. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Elena's skeletal hand resting inches from her own. 2 women, separated by decades, both prosecutors who'd been pulled into wars they'd never chosen. But Elena had faced her battle alone, while Sarah had something Elena had never possessed, people willing to stand with her. Agent Chen, Walsh said softly. Elena Santos spent 36 years building this case because she believed in justice more than she feared death. The question now is whether you're prepared to finish what she started. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the federal agents surrounding her. Tired, determined people who dedicated their lives to a fight that might never truly end. Then she thought of Emma and Lily upstairs, safe for the moment but forever changed by forces beyond their control. Elena Santos had died alone in this basement, protecting evidence that would outlive her. Sarah Chen had died here too, in a way, but from that death, something new was being born. Someone with Elena's determination and Sarah's expertise, backed by resources Elena never had. When do we start? Sarah asked. Agent Walsh's smile carried no warmth, only grim satisfaction. We start by getting you and your daughters out of this house alive. The leak in our task force means cartel operatives could arrive any time in the next 6 hours. The basement erupted into controlled chaos as Torres and 2 additional agents who'd appeared began securing Elena's evidence with military precision. Sarah watched them work, understanding that she was witnessing the culmination of a federal operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Everything, except the security breach that had turned their careful strategy into a desperate evacuation. "The safe house is 40 minutes north," Kowalski explained, helping Sarah to her feet. "But we can't use standard bureau protocols now. Someone inside our task force has been feeding information to the Valdez organization for months, maybe years." Sarah's prosecutorial instincts kicked in, cutting through her emotional exhaustion. "How many people knew about this operation?" 12 agents across 3 field offices, Walsh replied. "Plus administrative support, technical specialists, and Department of Justice oversight." Her expression darkened. Elena's intelligence network was compartmentalized for exactly this reason, but the final phase required coordinating multiple agencies. The sirens outside had stopped, replaced by the sound of vehicles arriving and departure. Sarah heard Emma's voice calling her name with increasing panic, and the maternal urgency overrode every other consideration. "I need to see my daughters. Now." Walsh nodded. "Agent Torres will escort you upstairs while we finish securing the evidence. But understand, from the moment you leave this basement, Sarah Chen, the bankruptcy lawyer, ceases to exist. The woman who emerges will be Elena Santos's successor, a federal witness with a target on her back that will never disappear." Sarah paused at the base of the stairs, looking back at Elena's remains one final time. The skeletal fingers that had once wielded prosecutorial authority with devastating effectiveness now lay still among scattered documents, but their work would outlive the flesh that had created it. "She never gave up," Sarah said quietly. 36 years of isolation, and she never stopped building the case. "Elena Santos was the finest prosecutor I ever knew," Walsh replied. "She could have disappeared completely, taken a new identity and vanished into witness protection. Instead, she chose to stay here, in this dying house, feeding U.S. intelligence that will destroy a criminal empire." Sarah climbed the stairs with Torres close behind, each step carrying her further from the life she'd known and deeper into Elena's war. The main floor bustled with FBI activity, agents photographing everything, technical specialists installing surveillance equipment, and coordinators managing the logistics of Sarah's transformation from victim to federal asset. Emma and Lily sat on the couch flanked by 2 agents who were clearly trying to project calm professionalism while managing 8-year-old twins traumatized by being woken in the middle of the night by strangers with guns. Both girls launched themselves at Sarah the moment she appeared, their small bodies trembling with relief and residual terror. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emma's voice carried the edge of a child trying desperately to understand adult chaos. "The agents said we have to leave, but they won't tell us where we're going." Sarah held her daughters close, breathing in their familiar scent while calculating how much truth they could handle. Elena Santos had faced her battle alone, but Sarah's war would be fought with children in tow, innocent lives that would be shaped by decisions they'd had no part in making. "We're going somewhere safe," she said finally. "Remember how I told you that sometimes lawyers have to protect important information? Well, the house we bought had very important information hidden inside it, and now we need to help the FBI keep it safe from bad people." Lily's tear-streaked face looked up at her with devastating trust. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. But we are in danger, which means we have to be very brave and do exactly what the FBI agents tell us to do." Kowalski appeared beside them, his expression urgent. "We need to move. Surveillance indicates unknown vehicles approaching from 3 directions, and we can't identify whether they're federal backup or cartel operatives." Sarah stood, lifting Lily while Emma pressed close against her side. Through the living room windows, she could see unmarked vehicles positioned strategically around the property, their headlights cutting through the October rain that had defined every day since they'd arrived at the house on Birch Hollow Lane. "Agent Chen," Walsh said, appearing with a thick folder marked classified, witness protection protocols. Elena Santos spent decades preparing for this moment, but she always knew someone else would have to see it through. The question now is whether you're prepared to become the prosecutor she trained you to be. Sarah looked around the moss-covered Victorian that had promised salvation and delivered judgment instead. Elena's spirit seemed to linger in every shadow, whispering encouragement across the decades that separated their parallel journeys from prosecutor to witness to warrior. The final confrontation was coming, and Sarah Chen was ready to meet it. The convoy of black SUVs materialized through the rain like predatory shadows, their synchronized approach confirming Sarah's worst fears. These weren't additional FBI units. The precision was wrong, the spacing too aggressive, the intent unmistakable even through the storm-darkened windows. "Contact!" Agent Torres's voice crackled through his radio. "Multiple unknowns approaching from Highway 22 and Birch Hollow intersection. Estimate 12 to 15 hostiles." Sarah felt Emma and Lily press closer against her legs as the house transformed into a fortress around them. FBI agents moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves at windows while Walsh coordinated their defense through rapid-fire communications with unseen command centers. The careful extraction operation had become a siege. "Safe house is compromised," Kowalski announced grimly. "Surveillance reports cartel vehicles already in position along our primary evacuation route." The weight of Elena's classified folder felt substantial in Sarah's hands. 36 years of accumulated evidence that had finally triggered the war both women had always known was coming. But Elena had faced her battle as a prosecutor turned witness. Sarah would meet hers as something new, a prosecutor who understood the evidence, a mother protecting her children, and a federal asset with resources Elena never possessed. "Agent Chen," Walsh said, her voice cutting through the tactical chatter. "Elena's protocols include contingencies for exactly this scenario. But executing them requires your active participation, not passive protection." Sarah understood immediately. Elena Santos had never intended her successor to hide in safe houses, while others fought her battles. The evidence cache in the basement wasn't just intelligence, it was ammunition for a counterattack that required prosecutorial expertise to deploy effectively. "What do you need me to do?" Walsh handed her a secure tablet displaying cartel organizational charts, financial networks, and operational structures that Sarah recognized from her money laundering prosecutions in Seattle. But Elena's intelligence revealed connections Sarah had never suspected. Corruption extending into federal agencies, judicial offices, and financial institutions across the Pacific Northwest. Elena identified 47 individuals who've been laundering Valdez cartel, proceeds through legitimate businesses, Walsh explained rapidly. But she never had a prosecutor with active case experience to build the legal framework for simultaneous arrests. Through the living room windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes as the first cartel vehicles opened fire on FBI positions. The sound of automatic weapons shattered the October night, transforming their desperate sanctuary into an active battlefield. Emma whimpered against Sarah's side, while Lily buried her face against her mother's shoulder. "The basement," Sarah said suddenly, her prosecutorial mind cutting through maternal terror to identify their tactical advantage. "Elena designed this house as a fortress. The basement has steel-reinforced walls and independent communication systems." Torres nodded approvingly. "Defensive position with hard cover and multiple exit routes through the old smuggling tunnels," Elena documented. As if responding to her words, the house's front windows exploded inward under sustained gunfire. Sarah grabbed both daughters and followed Walsh toward the basement stairs, Elena's evidence folder clutched against her chest like armor. Behind them, FBI agents returned fire while coordinating what Sarah now recognized as a fighting withdrawal designed to protect the evidence and its new guardian. The basement felt different now. Not Elena's tomb, but her command center, equipped with communication arrays and defensive positions that revealed the true scope of her 36-year intelligence operation. Wall-mounted screens flickered to life as Walsh activated systems that had been dormant since Elena's death, displaying real-time surveillance of cartel positions around the property. Elena Santos was never just a witness in hiding, Walsh explained, her fingers flying across control interfaces. She was running the most sophisticated domestic intelligence operation in FBI history, monitoring cartel activities across 3 states from this exact location. Sarah settled Emma and Lily in the reinforced corner Elena had designated as a safe zone, then turned her attention to the tablet displaying 47 arrest warrants that would cripple the Valdez organization's financial infrastructure. Each warrant required specific legal justifications that only a prosecutor with Sarah's expertise could provide in real time. The sound of gunfire intensified overhead as cartel operatives pressed their assault against FBI defensive positions, but Sarah found herself entering the focused state she'd always experienced during complex prosecutions, external chaos fading as her mind engaged with legal frameworks and evidentiary requirements. "Agent Walsh," she said, her voice steady, despite the violence above them. "Elena's intelligence is comprehensive, but it needs prosecutorial interpretation to maximize its effectiveness. I can identify which evidence supports RICO conspiracy charges, which supports federal racketeering indictments, and which provides grounds for asset forfeiture proceedings." Walsh smiled grimly as she coordinated defensive positions through her headset. Elena spent 36 years collecting evidence, but she always knew it would take a prosecutor to turn that evidence into justice. Sarah opened Elena's folder and began the work she'd been trained for her entire career, building the legal case that would finally end the war Elena Santos had fought alone for decades. Outside, the battle raged between federal agents and cartel operatives. But Sarah understood that the real victory would be won here, in this basement, as she transformed Elena's intelligence into the weapons of law that would destroy their enemies completely. The final test had begun, and Sarah Chen was ready to prosecute it. The gunfire above grew sporadic, replaced by an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She looked up from Elena's evidence folder, her prosecutorial instinct screaming that something had shifted in the tactical situation. Walsh's expression confirmed her fears. The FBI's defensive perimeter was failing. "They're inside the house," Torres's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the sound of splintering wood. "Multiple hostiles breaching through the kitchen. We're falling back to secondary positions." Emma's terrified whimper echoed through the basement as boots thundered across the floor above them. Sarah pulled both daughters deeper into Elena's reinforced corner, her mind racing through the legal frameworks she'd been analyzing even as maternal terror threatened to overwhelm her focus. "The evidence," she said urgently to Walsh. "If they capture this intelligence—" "They won't." Walsh's voice carried deadly certainty as she activated what Sarah now recognized as Elena's final protocol. Steel barriers began descending over the basement windows while hidden panels slid aside to reveal weapons caches and communication equipment that transformed Elena's sanctuary into a command bunker. Elena Santos spent 36 years preparing for this exact moment. The basement door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and smoke. Armed figures in tactical gear poured down the stairs, their automatic weapons trained on the FBI agents who'd positioned themselves between the cartel operatives and Sarah's family. But Sarah found herself studying their leader's face with the same intensity she'd once brought to cross-examining hostile witnesses. Rodrigo Valdez moved like a predator comfortable in his element, his expensive suit incongruous among the tactical gear of his subordinates. Sarah recognized him from federal surveillance photos, but seeing him in person revealed the cold intelligence that had built a criminal empire spanning decades. "Miss Sarah Chen," Valdez said, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd transformed himself, from street enforcer to corporate executive. The prosecutor who thought she could inherit Elena Santos's war. Sarah stood slowly, Elena's evidence folder pressed against her chest, while Emma and Lily cowered behind her legs. Around the basement, FBI agents maintained defensive positions despite being outnumbered 3-1, their weapons trained on cartel operatives who'd clearly expected less organized resistance. "Elena Santos died protecting evidence that will destroy your organization," Sarah said, her courtroom training keeping her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Killing me won't change that." Valdez smiled with the confidence of someone who'd eliminated countless threats to his empire. "Elena was a romantic who believed in justice. But you're a mother, Miss Chen. Your priorities are more practical." The implied threat to Emma and Lily hit Sarah like a physical blow, but it also triggered something Elena's intelligence had prepared her for. Her fingers found the concealed panic button Elena had built into every surface of the basement, not a call for help, but a trigger for the most devastating counterattack in federal law enforcement history. "Agent Walsh," Sarah said quietly, her eyes locked on Valdez. "Execute Elena's Protocol 7. Walsh's grin was feral as she activated the communication array Elena had spent decades building. Across the Pacific Northwest, 47 simultaneous arrests began as federal agents moved against every financial operative, corrupt official, and money laundering specialist in the Valdez organization's network. The evidence Sarah had analyzed in the past hour provided the legal foundation for coordinated raids that would cripple the cartel's infrastructure completely. "You think you understand Elena's intelligence?" Sarah continued, watching Valdez's expression shift as reports of the arrests began flooding his operatives' communications. But Elena wasn't just collecting evidence. She was building a legal weapon that required a prosecutor to deploy effectively. The sound of additional gunfire erupted from upstairs as FBI reinforcements finally breached the cartel's perimeter. But Sarah kept her focus on Valdez, recognizing the moment when a criminal realizes their empire is collapsing in real time. 36 years of evidence, she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd wielded in federal courtrooms. Financial records, wiretap transcripts, and witness statements that will support RICO conspiracy charges against every member of your organization. Elena Santos spent her entire life building this case, and I just prosecuted it. Valdez raised his weapon toward Sarah and her daughters, but Walsh was faster. The FBI agent's shot echoed through the basement like judgment itself, and Rodrigo Valdez crumpled beside Elena's remains, two bodies separated by decades, but united in death by the war that had consumed them both. As cartel resistance collapsed around them, Sarah sank to her knees and gathered Emma and Lily into her arms. The twins were safe, the evidence was secure, and Elena's 36-year battle had finally ended. But Sarah understood that her own war was just beginning, not as Elena's successor, but as something new entirely. She was a prosecutor who'd inherited a criminal empire's destruction, a mother who'd protected her children by embracing the very danger she'd tried to escape, and a federal witness who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that Elena Santos's sacrifice had not been in vain. The confrontation was over. The real work was about to begin. The aftermath settled over the basement like dust after an explosion. Sarah held Emma and Lily as FBI agents secured the scene around them, their daughters trembling gradually subsiding as the reality of safety replaced the terror of gunfire. But even as Sarah whispered reassurances, she felt the weight of what Agent Walsh was about to tell her pressing against her chest like a physical force. Sarah Walsh approached carefully, her expression carrying the gravity of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We need to discuss your situation." Sarah looked up from her daughter's tear-streaked faces, seeing her future reflected in Walsh's professional compassion. The evidence folder lay beside Valdez's body, its contents having served their purpose with devastating effectiveness. 47 arrests across 3 states. The Valdez cartel's financial network completely dismantled. Elena Santos's 36-year battle finally concluded. The victory had cost everything. "The trials," Sarah said, understanding before Walsh could explain. "Every prosecution we just initiated will require my testimony." Walsh nodded grimly. RICO conspiracy charges against 47 defendants. Federal racketeering indictments spanning multiple jurisdictions, asset forfeiture proceedings involving hundreds of millions in cartel proceeds. You're not just a witness, Sarah. You're the cornerstone of the largest organized crime prosecution in Pacific Northwest history. Sarah felt Emma shift against her side, her daughter's small hand finding hers with instinctive trust. The gesture broke something inside Sarah's chest as she calculated what her prosecutorial expertise was about to cost them all. "How long?" she whispered. "Conservative estimate? 8 years of trials, appeals, and related proceedings. You'll testify in federal courtrooms from Seattle to San Francisco, facing cross-examination from defense attorneys representing some of the most dangerous criminals in the country." The basement fell silent except for the sound of Emma's quiet breathing and the distant activity of FBI crime scene specialists. Sarah stared at Elena's remains, finally understanding the true scope of the woman's sacrifice. Elena hadn't just given up her identity and her freedom, she'd surrendered her entire existence to a war that had consumed everything she'd once been. "Witness protection," Sarah said, her voice hollow with recognition. "New identities for all three of you. Complete relocation to a classified location. No contact with your previous life until the final conviction is secured and all appeals are exhausted." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Emma and Lily's trust crushing her heart. They'd lost their father to her failed law practice, their home to bankruptcy, and their stability to the move to Oregon. Now her decision to fight Elena's war would cost them their very identities, their names, their memories, their connection to everything that had made them who they were. "Mommy?" Lily's small voice cut through Sarah's calculations like a knife. "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah looked down at her daughters, seeing their faces in the harsh basement lighting. Emma's determined expression so much like her own, Lily's gentle eyes reflecting absolute faith in her mother's ability to protect them. At 8 years old, they'd already survived more disruption than most children experienced in a lifetime. "We're going to be safe," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the devastation in her heart. "But we're going to have to be very brave." Walsh approached with a folder marked WITSEC protocols, her expression professional but not unkind. Elena's intelligence network identified 12 cartel associates who weren't arrested tonight. They'll spend years hunting for the prosecutor who destroyed their organization. Witness protection isn't just recommended. It's the only way you and your daughters survive what's coming. Sarah stood slowly, Elena's evidence folders still clutched in her hands. Around them, FBI agents photographed the crime scene, while others coordinated the logistics of what Sarah now recognized as her family's disappearance from the world they'd known. The moss-covered Victorian that had promised salvation had delivered something far more complex, justice at a price she was only beginning to understand. "Will they remember?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward Emma and Lily. "Children adapt better than adults," Walsh said gently. "New names become real names. New histories replace old ones. In time, this will feel like a story that happened to someone else." But Sarah would remember everything. Every case she'd prosecuted, every defendant she'd faced, every moment of terror in this basement. She'd carry the weight of Elena Santos's war and the cost of their victory for the rest of her life, watching her daughters grow up as strangers to themselves, while she testified in courtroom after courtroom, ensuring that Elena's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The battle was won. The cartel was destroyed. Justice had prevailed. The price was 3 lives that would never again belong to themselves. A prosecutor's family transformed into professional witnesses, their existence measured not in years but in trials, their freedom contingent on the destruction of enemies they'd never chosen to fight. Sarah Chen was about to disappear forever, taking Emma and Lily with her into a future where victory meant becoming ghosts of themselves, haunting the federal courtrooms where Elena Santos's evidence would finally deliver the justice she died protecting. The silence that followed Walsh's words felt heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. Sarah remained kneeling on the basement floor, Elena's evidence folder now closed beside her, its contents having already set in motion the machinery that would reshape their lives beyond recognition. Emma and Lily had stopped trembling, but their small bodies pressed against hers with an instinctive understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their world. "When?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning," Walsh replied, consulting her watch with the efficiency of someone accustomed to orchestrating disappearances. "The arrests we initiated tonight will hit the news cycle within hours. Every cartel associate who escaped our net will be searching for the prosecutor who triggered their organization's collapse." Sarah felt the weight of Elena's 36-year sacrifice settling across her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked to wear. The basement around them bore witness to one woman's determination to see justice served, regardless of personal cost. Now Sarah understood that justice had never been about the money, or even about the evidence. It had been about finding someone willing to carry Elena's war to its conclusion, no matter what the price. The twins will need psychological support, Sarah said, her maternal instincts asserting themselves even as her prosecutorial mind calculated the legal implications of their situation. 8 years in witness protection, testifying in federal trials. They'll grow up as strangers to themselves. Walsh's expression softened slightly. The Marshal Service has extensive experience with families in extended protection. Emma and Lily will receive counseling, educational support, and carefully monitored social integration. They'll have as normal a childhood as possible under the circumstances. But Sarah knew better than to trust those reassurances completely. She'd seen witness protection families during her years as a prosecutor. The hollow look in their eyes, the careful way they spoke about their past, the constant awareness that their safety depended on maintaining lies about their own identities. Elena Santos had lived that existence for 36 years, and it had slowly consumed everything she'd once been until only her mission remained. "The house," Sarah said suddenly, looking around the basement that had served as Elena's command center. "What happens to all of this?" "Crime scene for now, then likely federal seizure, as part of the ongoing investigation. Elena's intelligence network dies with her, but the evidence she collected will live on in the prosecutions you'll help us build." Sarah stood slowly, still holding Elena's folder despite knowing its contents had already been digitized and distributed to federal prosecutors across 3 states. The physical documents felt like a sacred trust, even though their practical purpose was complete. She thought about the moss-covered Victorian upstairs, the house that had promised salvation and delivered transformation beyond anything she could have imagined. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, are we going to live somewhere else again?" The question cut through Sarah's heart with surgical precision. Her daughters had already endured so much disruption, losing their father to her failed practice, their home to bankruptcy, their stability to the desperate move to Oregon. Now they would lose their very identities to ensure their survival. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling to meet Emma's eyes. "We're going to live somewhere new, and we're going to have new names, and it's going to be an adventure that we'll share together." Lily's face crumpled with confusion. "But I like being Lily. Why do I have to have a new name?" Sarah gathered both daughters into her arms, feeling the weight of choices that had seemed so clear just hours before. She'd wanted to protect them from the chaos of her professional failures, but instead, she'd led them into something far more complex, a war between justice and safety that offered no clean resolution. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard decisions to keep their families safe," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the grief threatening to overwhelm her. "The people who came here tonight wanted to hurt us because Mommy helped catch some very bad people. But now we're going to go somewhere safe, where those bad people can never find us." Walsh approached with documents that Sarah recognized as the beginning of their official erasure from the world they'd known. New social security numbers, birth certificates, school records. The bureaucratic infrastructure of disappearance that the federal government had perfected over decades of protecting witnesses whose testimony could topple criminal empires. "There's something else," Walsh said carefully. Elena left instructions. If something happened to her, and if someone continued her mission, she wanted them to have this. Walsh handed Sarah a small wooden box that had been concealed behind Elena's communication equipment. Inside, Sarah found a simple silver locket containing a photograph of a young woman who looked nothing like the Elena Santos she'd discovered in this basement. The woman in the picture had bright eyes and an unguarded smile. The person Elena had been before the cartel had forced her to become someone else entirely. She was 28 when she entered witness protection, Walsh explained. "About your age when this all began." Sarah closed the locket carefully, understanding Elena's final gift. It wasn't just a reminder of what she'd sacrificed, but proof that identity could survive, even when names and faces had to change. Elena Santos had died in this basement, but the young woman in the photograph had lived long enough to ensure that justice would finally be served. The immediate crisis was over, but Sarah understood that their real journey was just beginning. Tomorrow they would become other people, living other lives. But they would carry this truth forward into whatever future awaited them. The battle for justice had been won, but the price would echo through every day that followed. Sarah stood in the doorway of what had once been her bedroom in the moss-covered Victorian, watching the morning light filter through windows she would never see again. The house felt different now, not abandoned but complete. Elena's war was over, the cartel destroyed, justice finally served after 36 years of patient waiting. 3 months had passed since that night in the basement. 3 months of testimony before grand juries, briefings with federal prosecutors, and careful preparation for the trials that would define the next 8 years of their lives. But today marked something different. Their final morning as Sarah, Emma, and Lily Chen. "Mommy, I packed Mr. Bear," Lily said from behind her, clutching the stuffed animal that had survived every upheaval in their young lives. "Will he like his new name too?" Sarah turned, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. At 8 years old, Lily had adapted to their situation with remarkable resilience, treating their upcoming transformation like an elaborate game of pretend. Emma stood beside her twin, more serious but equally trusting, holding the small suitcase that contained everything from their old life they were permitted to keep. "Mr. Bear gets to stay exactly who he is," Sarah assured Lily, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Some things don't need to change, but almost everything else would." In 2 hours they would climb into an unmarked federal vehicle and drive toward identities that had been carefully constructed over months of bureaucratic precision. Sarah Martinez, a paralegal from Phoenix relocating to Portland for a fresh start with her daughters Sophia and Carmen. Their new lives had histories, references, school records, everything except the truth of who they'd been. Agent Walsh appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the professional sympathy Sarah had come to recognize over months of preparation. "The transport team is ready," Walsh said quietly. "Are you?" Sarah looked around the bedroom one final time, remembering the desperate woman who'd first climbed these stairs 3 months ago. That Sarah Chen had been running from professional failure and personal bankruptcy, seeking nothing more than basic shelter for her daughters. She'd found something far more complex, a war that had transformed her from a failed lawyer into the key witness in the largest organized crime prosecution in Pacific Northwest history. "Almost," Sarah said, reaching for Elena's silver locket on the nightstand. She'd worn it every day since that night in the basement, a reminder of identity's persistence even when names had to change. The young woman in the photograph smiled up at her. Elena before the cartel, before witness protection, before the decades of carefully maintained lies that had preserved her mission. Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, understanding that Elena Santos would disappear today along with Sarah Chen. But the truth they'd fought to protect would survive in federal courtrooms for years to come, carried forward by a prosecutor who'd learned that justice sometimes required becoming someone else entirely. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Will we see the house again someday?" The question caught Sarah off guard, highlighting what she'd lost in ways the official briefings hadn't captured. This crumbling Victorian had been more than shelter. It had been their chance to rebuild after everything fell apart. Now it would stand empty again, returning to the slow decay they'd briefly interrupted. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah answered honestly, "but we'll always remember it." They walked downstairs together, Sarah carrying the weight of Elena's evidence folder one final time. The basement door stood open, revealing the space where Elena had spent 36 years preparing for the justice they'd finally delivered. Federal technicians had dismantled the communication equipment, but the room still felt heavy with purpose, a command center that had orchestrated the destruction of a criminal empire. Sarah paused at the front door, her hand resting on the frame she'd first touched as a desperate single mother, seeking nothing more than affordable housing. The moss still covered the exterior walls, the foundation still showed signs of settling, but the house no longer felt abandoned. Elena's mission had been completed within these walls, and that completion had transformed the Victorian from a symbol of decay into something resembling a monument. "Miss Chen?" Walsh prompted gently. "It's time." Sarah nodded, taking Emma's and Lily's hands as they stepped onto the front porch together. The federal transport vehicle waited in the driveway, engine running, ready to carry them toward futures they'd never planned. In the distance, Salem continued its ordinary Monday morning routines, unaware that 3 of its residents were about to disappear forever. As they walked toward the vehicle, Sarah felt the weight of Elena's locket against her chest. Proof that identity survived even when names had to change, that justice could be served even when the price was everything you'd once called your own. She was no longer the bankruptcy lawyer who'd lost everything to a client's embezzlement, no longer the desperate mother who'd bought a crumbling house for $15,000. She was something new entirely, a prosecutor who'd inherited a 36-year war and carried it to victory, a federal witness who would spend the next 8 years ensuring that Elena Santos's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, a mother who'd chosen justice over safety and found strength she'd never known she possessed. The woman climbing into that federal vehicle was still Sarah Chen in every way that mattered, even as she prepared to become Sarah Martinez forever. The safe house in Portland looked nothing like the moss-covered Victorian they'd left behind. Clean suburban lines, beige siding, a lawn that someone maintained with mathematical precision, everything designed to blend seamlessly into the ordered anonymity of middle-class America. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Sophia and Carmen play in the backyard, their laughter carrying the same notes as Emma and Lily's had 6 years ago, though their voices now carried different names with unconscious ease. At 14, Sophia had grown tall and serious, her dark hair catching the afternoon light as she helped her younger sister build something elaborate with the cardboard boxes that seemed to multiply in their garage. Carmen, still small for her age but fierce in ways that reminded Sarah daily of the twins they'd once been, directed the construction project with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. They remembered fragments, sometimes. Sophia would pause mid-sentence when discussing school friends, her eyes distant as if reaching for something just beyond recall. Carmen occasionally asked about the old house with the fuzzy walls, but the questions came less frequently now, childhood's natural amnesia smoothing over the edges of memories too complex for young minds to carry. Sarah, she still thought of herself as Sarah, even after 6 years of answering to Martinez, touched Elena's locket beneath her blouse. The silver had worn smooth against her skin, a talisman that anchored her to the truth of who she'd been and why that truth mattered. The young woman in the photograph had faded with age, but her smile remained constant, a reminder that identity persisted even when everything else transformed. The trials had ended 8 months ago. 47 convictions, including 3 cartel lieutenants who would spend their remaining years in federal supermax facilities. The Valdez organization existed now only in Justice Department files and the memories of prosecutors who'd built careers on Elena Santos's evidence. Sarah's testimony had been the cornerstone of their case, hour after hour of careful recounting, her voice steady as she described finding the safe, discovering Elena's war room, understanding the weight of choices that had shaped 3 decades of careful planning. Agent Walsh had visited twice since the trials concluded, both times bearing news of successful prosecutions in adjacent cases. The intelligence network Elena had constructed continued yielding results even after her death, a legacy that reached far beyond the money they'd never been allowed to keep. The $260 million had been seized as evidence, though Sarah sometimes wondered if Elena would have approved of the government programs that had ultimately received those funds. Not that it mattered anymore. Sarah earned her living now as a paralegal at a mid-sized Portland firm, her legal expertise carefully disguised beneath fabricated credentials that painted her as competent but unremarkable. The work felt hollow after the intensity of federal prosecution, but it provided stability for Sophia and Carmen while keeping her connected to the law she still believed could serve justice, even when justice required sacrifices no reasonable person would choose. The mailbox at the end of their driveway read Martinez in neat black letters, installed by the property management company that handled their lease through a federal program she'd learned not to examine too closely. Their neighbors knew them as the quiet single mother and her daughters who'd moved from Phoenix after a divorce, a cover story that explained Sarah's careful distance from casual friendships while allowing the girls' normal social lives. Sophia appeared at the back door, her expression carrying the teenage exasperation Sarah remembered from her own adolescence. Mom, Carmen's trying to build a courthouse out of cardboard again. Should I be worried about her mental health? Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine warmth. I think she just likes the architecture. Did you help her with the jury box? Obviously. I'm not letting my sister construct an unconstitutional courtroom in our backyard. The casual legal knowledge in Sophia's voice caught Sarah off guard, a reminder that some things persisted across identity changes whether intended or not. Her daughters might answer to different names, but they'd inherited her respect for justice, her understanding that systems mattered because people's lives depended on their proper function. As evening approached, Sarah called the girls inside for dinner, watching them wash their hands at the kitchen sink while debating the proper placement of judicial benches with the seriousness of constitutional scholars. Carmen's cardboard courthouse would join the elaborate structures that filled their garage, a Supreme Court building from last summer, a law library from winter break, architectural tributes to institutions she'd never consciously been taught to revere but somehow understood anyway. Later, after homework and bedtime stories and the quiet rituals that marked their new normal, Sarah stood again at her kitchen window. The neighborhood slept peacefully around them, ordinary families living ordinary lives behind windows that glowed with television light and the warm chaos of dinnertime conversations. Elena's locket caught the moonlight as Sarah touched it one final time before heading upstairs. Somewhere in the federal archives, evidence folders bore witness to a 36-year war that had finally ended in justice. Somewhere in their carefully constructed lives, 3 people who'd once been named Chen carried forward the truth of why that war had mattered. The woman climbing the stairs was Sarah Martinez now, completely and forever. But she was also still Sarah Chen in every way that counted, a mother who'd chosen justice over safety and discovered that both were possible when you learned to become exactly who the world needed you to be.